The city woke slowly beneath a gray sky, its heartbeat muffled by rain and the drone of engines churning water into the gutters. He had been there since dawn, leaning against the edge of the building, shoes soaked through, hat dripping, invisible by design. Commuters walked past in polished shoes and earbuds, umbrellas bobbing like excuses. No one looked at him for more than half a second. No one asked if he needed help. No one considered that the man hunched in soaked layers might see them more clearly than they saw themselves. The building towered behind him, 43 stories of glass and prestige. Inside, 100 offices buzzed with plans, budgets, ego. Everything in that place screamed clean and rich and important. But out here, all of that meant nothing. Out here, he was another shadow against the sidewalk. And that was exactly what he wanted. He had returned to this place not out of bitterness, but memory. It was here, outside this very lobby, where a security guard had once shoved him back onto the street, calling him filth while pretending it was about policy. Here, where he had watched the same people who now ran the city's nonprofits step over him on their way to charity galas. And here, where he'd first picked up the flyer for a night shelter that changed the trajectory of his life. Now he owned the entire building. Silently. Legally. Absolutely. But no one knew. Not yet. Inside the lobby, 2 guards noticed him. One motioned. The other reached for the desk phone. He saw them through the glass. Their expressions were the same as always, annoyed, disdainful, ready to remove. Not ask. Not check. Just push. He didn't move. He let the moment hang. Let them stew in the authority they believed was theirs. The younger one came out first, barking empty threats. The older followed, more measured but no less cruel. The phrase came quickly, "This isn't a homeless shelter." He didn't argue. He simply nodded and stepped aside, pushing his cart into the street as if defeated. And yet, before leaving, he glanced once at the security camera mounted above the door. He made sure they saw his eyes. Later that afternoon, while the guards laughed about chasing off another one, an email arrived in the inbox of the building's management company. It contained 3 attachments: 1, a scanned copy of the property title; 2, a letter of authorization from the nonprofit holding company he founded; 3, a directive. Effective immediately, he was taking personal control of all lobby policy, security staff, and tenant agreements on the lower 6 floors. No warning. No memo. Just quiet, irreversible change. And the 2 men who mocked him that morning? They would be escorted out before the end of the day, politely, professionally, but with finality. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was rebalancing the scale. Because he remembered what it felt like to sleep outside in the cold. And no one who laughed at that would be allowed to profit from the shelter of his roof. By the time the evening rush spilled into the city's veins, the lobby was no longer the same. Something unseen had shifted. The furniture remained untouched, the lights still glowed softly overhead, but the temperature of the room felt different, as if the building itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too many years. He returned just before sunset. Not in rags, not with the cart. This time in silence, dressed simply, carrying nothing but the same weathered folder tucked beneath his arm. The desk staff didn't recognize him, at least not yet. But the 2 security guards were gone. No explanation given. No protest allowed. Just a change in personnel that arrived like a quiet verdict. People began to notice. The man who had been chased away just that morning now stood behind the reception desk, not in confrontation, but in ownership. He moved like he belonged, not arrogantly, but with the gravity of someone who had earned his space the hard way. And even though no one had formally introduced him, the air around him said enough. An executive from the 5th floor walked by, doing a double take before slipping into the elevator with a furrowed brow. 2 women from HR whispered in the corner, wondering if there had been an acquisition they hadn't heard about. The building's manager finally appeared, pale and apologetic, asking for a meeting in private. He declined. There would be time for meetings later. Tonight, he had other priorities. He left the lobby and walked the perimeter of the building slowly, deliberately, watching the world with the eyes of someone who had once been ignored by it. On the side street, under the overhang, another man now stood, coat damp, head low, holding a torn bag filled with everything he owned. The cycle had returned. But this time, it stopped with him. He approached the man gently, saying nothing, simply offering his hand and leading him back toward the lobby. Past the threshold. Past the silence. Into the warmth. The man hesitated, eyes wide, waiting for someone to shout. But no one did. Because everything had changed. Not just who held the deed, but what the building now stood for. Over the following days, the transformation deepened. The bottom floors, once leased to boutique law firms and overpriced coffee shops, were vacated. Not abruptly, but with new terms, new rules, and new expectations. Tenants who refused to adapt were given their notice. Others, social workers, career counselors, and mental health professionals, were brought in to take their place. One wing was redesigned for transitional housing, another for free meals. The marble lobby became a place where no one had to prove their worth to be warm. And yet it was done with dignity, with design, with intention. This wasn't a rescue project. It was a revolution dressed in respect. And through it all, he remained calm, quiet, observant. He remembered every person who had told him he didn't belong. But more than that, he remembered those who didn't say anything at all, who simply looked the other way. He had built this place not for them, but for the ones still standing outside glass doors with no keys in hand. Now the doors were open. And the building? It wasn't a homeless shelter. It was something far stronger. A sanctuary born from silence. The building had always been a monument to image. Steel beams, imported stone, glossy elevators that hummed with pretense. It was designed to impress from the outside in, to intimidate, not welcome. But beneath the marble floors and brushed chrome fixtures, something had long been missing: purpose. He knew that well. He remembered the echo of his footsteps on those tiles years ago when he wandered in one night, hoping for directions, and was met with suspicion. Not because of anything he said or did, just because of what he looked like, what he wore, how he smelled after 3 nights in the rain. No one had listened. No one had seen. They'd simply sent him back out into the dark, their stares sharper than words. But now the stares were different. Not because he was recognized, but because the building was responding to him. Slowly, reluctantly, respectfully. He didn't erase the corporate spaces entirely. That would have been easy. No, he kept the structure, the scaffolding of the system. He simply rewired it. Floor by floor, department by department. Where luxury boutiques once hawked overpriced suits, job readiness centers now offered tailored coaching. Where a silent wellness studio once catered to executives in need of mindfulness, a trauma-informed therapist now treated those fresh off the streets free of charge. The staff noticed. They adjusted or left. Some, the proud and the rigid, packed their offices with bitterness. They called it a fall from grace. They said he was tarnishing the building's prestige. But others stayed. Others leaned in. Others who had always wished the place had more soul than shine. A janitor from floor 12 who used to eat alone now sat among tenants and clients alike, his stories finally heard. A former receptionist was promoted to operations lead after organizing the volunteer rotation better than anyone else. The walls that once divided class, status, and power had not been knocked down. They had been made irrelevant. The transformation wasn't just logistical, it was symbolic. Every decorative feature was reevaluated. Gone were the abstract sculptures that no one could name. In their place, framed portraits of people who had once lived on the streets, now thriving, not as pity pieces, but as proof, testaments to resilience. The boardroom remained, but its windows were thrown open during meetings. No more tinted glass, no more seclusion. He invited city leaders, activists, former social workers, people who had spent years doing the kind of work money usually ignored. They didn't wear suits. They didn't speak in polished corporate terms. But they knew what mattered. He took notes in those meetings, not because he didn't know what to do, but because leadership wasn't about commanding. It was about listening deeply, consistently, humbly. News began to spread, quiet at first, a whispered shift in the city's landscape. Journalists came sniffing for angles, but he refused interviews. He didn't want fame. He wanted replication. He wanted the blueprint buried beneath the marble to be seen for what it was. Not a one-time miracle, but a model. And it worked. One rainy morning, months after the changes began, a woman approached the building holding a child wrapped in a coat that wasn't hers. She looked at the sign above the door, hesitant. Her lips moved silently as she read it. It didn't say shelter. It didn't say charity. It just said welcome. She stepped inside. No one stopped her. No one questioned. Someone brought her tea. And high above the lobby, he watched. Not like an overseer, but like a man who understood that change isn't declared. It's lived. At night, the building took on a glow that was different from the cold fluorescence it once knew. Light spilled from windows not as a warning, but as a signal. One that told the street below that something was happening here, something real. It no longer repelled the city's broken edges. It drew them in gently, like a lantern in a storm. He often wandered the hallways at that hour. Not to patrol, not to oversee, but to feel. The footsteps that used to echo hollowly now shared the floor with softer ones. New shoes, bare feet, wheels of carts no longer pushed in shame. There was laughter in the stairwells, the quiet kind that rises from newly found dignity. There were tears too, but they weren't of despair. They were release. There had been pushback, of course. Local business associations muttered about standards. A few of the wealthier tenants on the upper floors voiced concern that the building had lost its focus. One firm threatened to terminate its lease if the downstairs remained an eyesore. He let them go. Gracefully, efficiently. He knew the cost of compromise, and he had already paid too much of himself to make others comfortable. Besides, for every skeptic who left, 10 others arrived. They didn't wear tailored blazers or carry portfolio cases. They brought laptops and backpacks, hopes in fragile envelopes. They didn't come for meetings. They came to begin again. He made space for them all. An entire floor was now dedicated to incubation, microbusinesses born from struggle. A former mechanic, once unhoused for 6 years, now trained apprentices in a retooled garage space behind the building. A woman who once traded food stamps for baby formula ran a pop-up bakery in what had been a sterile conference room. There were no motivational speeches, no banners, just opportunity. One evening, as he was passing the newly transformed reading room, he noticed a man sitting near the window. The man wore a scarf pulled high over his face, eyes darting, hands clenched. Something in his posture struck a familiar chord, defensiveness shaped by years of being treated like an intruder. He walked over slowly, offered no questions, just placed a small laminated card on the table. "No one will ask you to leave here." The man didn't speak. He simply nodded, and his shoulders dropped half an inch. Sometimes that's all it takes to start over. Meanwhile, city officials began showing up. Cautious, curious, and often pretending they weren't impressed. They took notes, asked procedural questions, studied the building's model with the detachment of people looking for reasons not to change. But something in the structure unnerved them. There was no central figure to blame or control. Though he owned the building, he didn't hold all the levers. Power had been decentralized, shared with boardrooms that now included those once barred from the front steps. He had dismantled the idea that ownership was synonymous with domination. And in its place, he had built something no one could weaponize against him. The new ecosystem wasn't perfect, but it was alive, and its heartbeat echoed louder each night. As he stepped back out into the rain, coat drawn tight, he looked one last time at the entrance. It no longer loomed. It welcomed. The same door that once turned him away had become a passage for others, and he had left it open on purpose. Winter arrived not with fury, but with silence. The cold crept in gradually, settling into the corners of the city like a forgotten debt. He noticed it not through the thermostat, but through the faces that reappeared, worn, wind-chapped, scanning the skyline for warmth that didn't come from concrete. They came back like ghosts. Not from the dead, but from the city's blind spots, men who had disappeared into alleys, women who had drifted through shelters like fog. Some remembered him. Most didn't. That didn't matter. What mattered was that they returned, drawn by rumor, by whispers passed between soup lines and over cracked phone screens. There's a place. Not a shelter. Not a trap. Just a place where you don't have to explain why you're cold. They came, and he welcomed them without speeches. He had been one of them too long to forget how exhausting it was to keep retelling your pain just to be allowed indoors. Each evening, he stood near the lobby's edge, watching the front doors open not with suspicion but recognition. Volunteers, once homeless themselves, offered hot drinks and clean socks like currency. Nothing flashy. Nothing performative. Just humanity offered with eye contact and patience. And slowly, the building earned a reputation. Not for saving people, but for not failing them. It became a place where shame was left at the curb, where someone could enter with nothing and still feel they had something to protect. Of course, the world outside didn't stop. Developers sniffed around, curious why such a lucrative property wasn't being used properly. A local news anchor ran a slanted segment questioning the safety of the new model. Even a former city council member mocked the place publicly, saying it blurred the line between charity and business too much. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. The people spoke for him. A janitor handed an envelope to a reporter. Inside was her first ever paycheck, signed not by a private contractor but the building's trust. A nurse who used to sleep 2 blocks away shared her licensing certificate obtained through the free prep program hosted on the 5th floor. A girl no older than 7 pointed to a classroom window and said, "That's where my mom started over." These weren't testimonials. They were declarations. That what the city called risky, they called rescue. That what others dismissed as soft, they lived as structure. That what once stood as a monument to exclusion had become a fortress of return. In a back office that had once belonged to a real estate lawyer, he kept a ledger. Not for profits, but for people. Not names, just moments. He wrote down the first time someone smiled without flinching. The first time someone asked how to volunteer instead of how to eat. The first time someone knocked and said, "I heard I could help here." It was the kind of book no investor would understand. But to him, it was the only report that mattered. One night, as a snowstorm howled against the windows, a young man burst into the lobby. His face was red with cold. His coat soaked. The security team, trained in de-escalation, hired from the very community they served, didn't question him. They just opened the door wider. The man looked around, stunned, then whispered, "This isn't a shelter." To which the receptionist, without looking up, replied softly, "No, it's better." And upstairs, he added one more line to the ledger. "They've started saying it on their own." The city had forgotten how to breathe. For years, it had inhaled ambition and exhaled exclusion. But now, here, on this corner of wet asphalt and steel spine, a different rhythm pulsed. It wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. But it was steady. And it started with him. Not because he demanded it. Because he refused to stop believing it was possible. The building, once a monument to ego, had evolved into a living thing. It adjusted, responded, listened. Its walls no longer held power, they distributed it. Its elevators didn't lift only the entitled. They carried the weary and the willing in equal measure. There were still moments of tension. Old prejudices didn't vanish in the glow of LED lighting and free Wi-Fi. Some entered suspiciously, shoulders stiff, scanning the room for judgment that never came. Others came looking to exploit, faking stories, testing limits. But the building had grown smart. Not in software, but in people. A woman who once begged for change at the corner store now ran the intake desk. She could tell in seconds who needed food and who needed firm kindness. A former parolee turned program director set the tone in nightly community meetings, reminding everyone, "We're not here to save anyone. We're here so folks can save themselves." And he remained a quiet presence, rarely taking the center of any room. He preferred the edges. That's where he had lived for so long. That's where change always begins. He walked the building differently now. Not to inspect, but to feel the temperature of hope. In the cafeteria, a teenager practiced code on a donated laptop. In the therapy wing, a father read aloud to his daughter. On the roof, once reserved for executive cocktail parties, there was now a greenhouse, and in it, laughter and dirt-covered hands. He didn't erase what the building had been. He had simply repurposed it. The final shift came not with policy, but with a letter. It arrived folded and signed, printed on old paper. It read, "I was one of the men who told you to leave the lobby that day. I saw what you've done since. I'm ashamed, but I'm learning. Thank you for not turning your back like I did. I'm trying to become someone my kids won't be embarrassed by." He held the letter for a long time. Not for validation, but because it meant the building had done something far rarer than shelter. It had changed the inside of someone who once stood at the top. On the 1-year anniversary of the transformation, there was no gala, no press, no PR statement, just a single plaque embedded beside the door. It said, "This building once served the few. Now it serves the many." Not because it had to, but because someone believed it could. He touched the plaque gently, then stepped into the wind. The rain had started again. And this time, it didn't drive anyone away. It simply passed over a building that had finally learned how to let people in.